Hello. My name is Ian, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today, we are going to take a break in the usual discussion topic, which is multi-channel and surround mixes, to talk about just a plain old great stereo mix. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, the 1974 Genesis classic, the surrealist double album that is perhaps their most experimental work. This is the sort of thing that could only have been made in the early 70s, and for me, easily places among some of my favorite ambitious conceptual albums, such as Jethro Tull's A Passion Play. Genesis are one of those bands that I feel have never really been served well with a reissue campaign. And this album in particular has always been one that I've sought out an excellent master of. So much so that I have bought multiple copies of this album over the years. And my appreciation of an album, my love for an album, is directly proportionate to the number of times that I've bought it. So let's just talk about this so you can see some of my qualifications. So this wasn't the first version of the album that I bought. The first one was actually the so-called definitive edition, released in 1994, but this would have been the second one. This is a, I want to say early 80s, like 1982-ish Atco pressing. I'm not really much of a vinyl guy, but I think this is one of those cases where I was looking through the album bins at a local antique shop, and I saw this puppy for $5, which is incredible, especially for the condition it's in. And with this, you get the full gatefold with the story inside, and there's also the lyric sheets. I was hoping it would sound a little better than this Atlantic 1994 master, which is purports to be the definitive edition. And I always found this one to be very brittle sounding, very cold, not particularly dynamic. But I've heard worse. You could be introduced to this album with a worse version, but I found very quickly that I preferred the sound of the vinyl, and I would listen to that in headphones all the time, like when I was still a teenager. See, I went through this period where I thought I was a punk and that I didn't need prog rock in my life anymore. And one of my friends, Jocko, who's actually been on the channel, gifted me copies of Duke and Wind and Wuthering, and that was my way back in. I went on this journey to find the best version of every Genesis record available. And in the process, I did some research on Steve Hoffman, which you might know me from that board. If you follow that board, I do post on there pretty often. But this is actually the CD, which is taken from the album master, the same Atco 1982-ish master, although I think this came out in 87, 88. And it does sound a lot better. The dynamics are there, but it seems to lack the punchiness of the 94 CD, to my ears at least. But for a few months, this was an easy choice for me. I would just turn up the bass a little bit on it and crank it up, and I thought it sounded great. I even got so geeky as to A and B this to the record, like I synced them, and I had the record going and I had this CD at the same time, and I preferred the sound of the CD hands down. I'm sorry to you vinyl purists, but particularly for this pressing, I just think the CD sounds better. But with the announcement that Analogue Productions finally released their SACD of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, I had to pick it up, especially since I bought this. This is the first in their series of Genesis remasters on SACD. And despite the fact that this version of the album is lacking a bit in bottom end. I thought it made up for it in incredible detail, and I was hearing stuff in this record I'd never heard before, including some issues. Like I was hearing some problems with like pitch, and the more I looked into it, the more I discovered that was probably present in the master, and this just brought it out in some way. So, I was a little bit hesitant to pick up the Analogue Productions edition of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, especially since it's kind of expensive, especially for a CD. But it was one of those things where I just thought, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is my all-time favorite Genesis record, and it's one of my favorite records, period. Life's too short not to own the best possible version of your favorite record. So I went ahead and took a deep breath and picked this up, and I am so glad that I did. Now, first off, I would like to talk a little bit about the album itself and why it's so special to me. This was the first Genesis album that I heard, right next to Trespass, which is a heck of an introduction to this band, especially given that most people were introduced to the band like through their 80s material. I first heard Trespass and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway almost at the exact same time. I always had this weird thing where like, if I discovered an artist, I just wanted to dive into the deep end. Like whatever the most divisive and difficult work there possibly was, I just went for it. And like a crazy person. And it's like with Yes, the first Yes record that I heard all the way through was Tales from Topographic Oceans. ELP, I heard Brain Salad Surgery first. And Captain Beefheart, I think Safe as Milk and Trout Mask Replica, I heard almost at the same time. So Genesis, I think I just, this album fascinated me. The pictures of like Peter Gabriel's costumes, especially the Slipperman costume, something about that abject weirdness spoke to me, and I picked it up. But this is a rather interesting album because it's, some might argue that it's a transitional album because I kind of see it as the emergence of Phil Collins and Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks as the nucleus of Genesis. You have the situation where Peter Gabriel's daughter was born during the making of this record, and she had health problems, and he was kind of split between working in the studio and going to visit his wife and daughter in the hospital. And at the same time, guitarist Steve Hackett, his marriage was falling apart. So they feel a little bit absent, especially as you get deeper into the album. And I feel like it's interesting to hear how the trio Genesis is starting to come to light for the first time. That's sort of how I read this record. And it's a very intense record at times. And I think that it borders on punk, especially the vocal delivery and some of the subject matter are a lot snottier than, say, Dancing with the Moonlit Night or Supper's Ready. Like this is, gritty New York City streets stuff with a surrealist Alejandro Jodorowsky edge to it. And if you've been following this channel for a long time, you may already know that I'm a huge fan of the film El Topo, which influenced this album, as per Peter Gabriel's admission. So this sort of warped surreality is something that's always spoken to me, and I continue to love it to this day. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the new master. So as I said, none of the previous versions of this album have really satisfied me. And I was starting to believe that maybe this album wasn't recorded that well. Now, I know some of the early Genesis records weren't particularly produced well, like Nursery Crime and Trespass. But I feel like around Foxtrot, they were really starting to get a handle on that. And, Selling England by the Pound is a wonderful production. And, of course, so is Trick of the Tail, which might be my second favorite Genesis record of all time. But I think that this new master, the first thing that I was hearing was increased bass presence, and I could hear a lot more of what Mike Rutherford was doing, both in the bass guitar work and his bass pedals. And sometimes it's bordering on like too much. If you're used to previous masters, it can kind of take you off guard how much bass there is. But the bass frequencies never seem to obscure other instruments that are heard at the same time. So it's a win for me. And you can also hear, especially on tracks like Fly on a Windshield and Broadway Melody of 1974, which are indexed incorrectly, by the way, on this album, just like the 94 master. But you can hear the bass get really loud and then pull back into the texture after a while. And to my ear, this sounds like it's the natural dynamics that are inherent in the recording, and not a mistake. So I really like this, even though I'm not used to hearing it. I really like this. And that's another area in which this new master excels, is dynamics. There are parts of this album where the music swells up and it fills your room. It fills your whole environment. It's almost like an Atmos mix, even though it's not. It's totally just the original stereo mix. But songs like The Chamber of 32 Doors with those big mellotron swells really take my breath away. And I can also point to there's like a few tracks, especially on disc 2, that were always kind of also rans to me, like they didn't stick out. But now a track like Hairless Heart blows me to Mars. And you can hear just the slightest little bit of twinkling 12 strings, I assume 12 strings from Steve Hackett and presumably Mike Rutherford as well, that erupt into these huge crescendos that just kind of knock me back in my chair. And I also noticed, Phil Collins' drums are much more discernible, and his tom-toms especially have so much heft and weight to them. He sounds like he's sitting here striking his drums in the room with me. And like even a song that's not that intense in terms of drumming, like Carpet Crawlers, I loved hearing all those little intricacies that he was doing with the higher percussion. You also have, I think, increased clarity around the vocals. A song that immediately jumps into mind is In the Colony of Slippermen, where you have Peter Gabriel doing that kind of raspy Slipperman voice. And this new master really reveals a lot of the interesting production techniques that were in use back then, and things that I think previously like struck me as like maybe a mistake now sound intentional. And I feel like I can understand what Peter Gabriel is saying in some of those Slipperman moments a lot better. I would also point to a song like Back in New York City, where he is just barking. This is like punk rock type vocals before punk rock. And this new master really helped me appreciate a lot of what he was doing with his voice back then. And I would also point to like the title track, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, as another song where the vocals seem so well captured. I love hearing more of Phil Collins' backing vocals on songs like Here Comes the Supernatural Anesthetist, where he's singing those almost like doo-wop inspired vocals. I also like what the new mastering has done for a lot of the more ambient tracks on disc 2, like The Waiting Room. That's the second track. It's kind of Genesis in Henry Cal mode, and it has a lot of like audible jump scares now because the dynamic changes are such a huge leap from one to the next. I found this track very sinister and creepy and disturbing in a special way. And then like when you get to Anyway, which is misspelled, by the way, on the back it says Anway. I just noticed that. But when you get to Anyway, and you have that dynamic crunch, much like earlier in the album with a song like Fly on the Windshield, which I think is one of the most famous songs on the album for that. It really punches you in the chest in a way that I always wanted this album to hit me. But prior to this, it never really did. And so, again, like I feel like a lot of songs that I kind of overlooked, such as Riding the Scree, which is essentially a Tony Banks workout. Now that stands out to me as one of the strongest tracks on the album. Like I love hearing all the interaction of the parts, and you get the sense like somebody like Mike Rutherford and his bass playing, like he doesn't just play a note, he plays the right note. And the use of harmony and counterpoint, especially between him and Tony Banks, is really amazing, really expertly employed here. What else can I say about this album? I think it's an absolute masterpiece. I know that a lot of people think it's flawed. I kind of hear the flaws, although they seem less apparent to me on this new master. And I can honestly say that I enjoy every single track on it, even like some of the more ambient pieces like Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats, which feels like something out of a Popol Vuh soundtrack. Like I could hear this playing over Aguirre, The Wrath of God, the Werner Herzog film. Like that's kind of the images that come into mind. So I recommend this. I mean, if it's one of those things, it's like, obviously we're talking about something that isn't inexpensive. But I think that if you love this album, it's worth checking out. Now, of course, very soon we are getting the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway box set, which is looking to be rather tasty. There is a new master of the original album. And there's also a concert live at the Shrine Auditorium, which has been previously issued, with overdubs included. That's going to be on the new box set, as well as a Dolby Atmos mix. Now, of course, I am super interested in hearing the Atmos mix, and I do plan to pick it up because I'm a rabid Genesis fan, especially of this album. I may not double dip for something like Selling England by the Pound or A Trick of the Tail, but this one has always been really special to me. So if you're interested in hearing my review on that depends very much on the success of this video. So please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment. And let me know if you're interested in listening to me compare the Analogue Productions master with the new, I guess, officially released product. It's really strange that this comes out so close to the band's own reworked version of this album, because it obviously invites comparisons. I feel like this is going to be the more purist version, whereas the newer version is probably going to be more like the 2007 remix, which I've never heard. That's the only version of the album that I've never explored, because I've heard such negative things about that remix program in general. Now, there are a few quibbles with the packaging. I'm not a huge fan of these CD cases. I like the fact that they kind of distinguish the Analogue Productions releases from other CDs in your collection, yet they still fit next to other discs. That I like. What I dislike is how the discs were stacked in the case itself. And I'm also kind of not a big fan of how the booklet is placed, because my copy of Selling England by the Pound developed a huge crease in the booklet for me taking it in and out. So I kind of wish that they would have issued it in just a standard, double disc case, sort of like I've put the discs in here. But aside from that minor quibble, I'm happy with this. And I almost feel like this is the last word on this album. Now, we'll look and see what the band themselves come up with. That's coming out in late March. So, I'm certainly open to being blown away by what Tony Banks and Peter Gabriel concoct. But I feel like for a lot of us, this is probably the ultimate version of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So I was talking about that vinyl release of The Lamb that I have, and I wanted to point some of you to who may be vinyl people. I actually have a new release on vinyl. Now, I didn't write any of this stuff. I mixed and mastered it, so I handled the technical engineering work. But this is a new space rock project influenced by the likes of Noi. There's a healthy smattering of the Muffins in there too, thanks to the presence of Dave Newhouse. But this is pressed on lovely purple vinyl, and there are 2 videos taken from this album on my channel, one of which I released earlier this week. So if you're interested in checking out what I do during the day hours when I'm not watching movies or listening to music or reviewing stuff for YouTube, if you're interested in my business, please do check out these videos and perhaps even consider picking up a copy of Moon X's Rocket to the Moon for yourself, because it might be something up your alley. All right, well, that's it for me for today. Once again, my name's Ian, and the next video you will see from me is the Jethro Tull live mixes ranking, which has been heavily requested by my viewers ever since I did the studio album ranking a few months back. All right, thanks for joining me today. It's been super fun, and you will hear from me real soon. Bye-bye.